Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Tania Johns, the National Organizing Director at 1000 Women Strong, and I'm so glad that you've joined us tonight for our Why Courts Matter in Pennsylvania, hosted in partnership with our friends at New Pennsylvania Project. At 1000 Women Strong, we believe that real power is built 365 days a year, not just during presidential elections, but in every conversation, every local race, and every ballot we cast. Tonight's event is part of that ongoing work to educate, inspire, and mobilize voters around the issues that impact our daily lives. The courts influence nearly everything, from voting rights and reproductive justice to education, policing, and economic equity. And this November, which is actually about 8 weeks from today, Pennsylvanians once again have judicial races on the ballot that will shape the direction of justice in their state for years to come. So tonight is more than a civics lesson. It's a real conversation about power, accountability, and communities we seek to protect by showing up at the ballot box. Thank you for being here and for being a part of this work. After our presentation, we'll open up the floor for questions, so get ready to engage. With that being said, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ms. Kadida Kenner, CEO of New Pennsylvania Project, to kick it off tonight's discussion on why courts matter in Pennsylvania. Kadida, over to you.
Okay, there we go. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking here in the Zoom room so I can pinpoint some folks. Just want to check in and see if I can get an idea of where people are joining us from so I can speak directly to you tonight. And happy to be here. Okay, so my name is Kadida Kenner. I'm the founding CEO of the New Pennsylvania Project. We're a voting rights organization and happy to be part of tonight's conversation with 1000 Women Strong. We've had the pleasure of coordinating with your organization in at least 2 events in the last 2 months, I'd say. Our most recent event together was in Homewood, Pittsburgh, where we had put on an event with 2 of Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices who came out to Homewood. It's a section of the city in Pittsburgh that most judges would probably not go. And it was very important to have the justices and judges there in the presence of folks there in Homewood to talk about the importance of the court and for them to actually meet one of these justices or judges that we rarely get to see. So often people do not vote in judicial elections or engage in the judiciary because they don't know who they are, what they do. They've never met anybody. So tonight I'm going to present to you Why Courts Matter, the PA edition. And for those of you joining from other places, I hope that you can take some lessons away from what's happening in Pennsylvania and share that out. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll go ahead and I'll launch that and get this started. And we can have a great conversation this evening about why courts matter. Okay. So can someone come off mute? Just let me know you see everything okay, and I'll get going.
Yep, I can see.
All right.
Yeah.
Great, great. Okay, well, here we go. So why courts matter, Pennsylvania edition. So why courts and the PA judicial elections matter. This is really important for us in Pennsylvania, as we're one of only 7 states in the entire country in which we actually get to elect all of our judges and justices. And so Pennsylvanians are very powerful, and we take this power seriously. So I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I founded in May of 2021. After several years of living in Harrisburg and working for the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, trying to bring about change through policy, such as trying to raise the wage in Pennsylvania that's still stuck at $7.25 an hour when every state surrounding us has increased it, trying to make sure that we are fairly funding public education in the Commonwealth, because the way in which we've historically funded it has not been equitable in any way. That wasn't something that was happening legislatively. Had no success on that one either for quite some time. Trying to fund the wealthiest people in Pennsylvania, fund these millionaires, these ultra wealthy multimillionaires and billionaires to pay their fair share of taxes. And that also unsuccessful. And after 5 years of working in Harrisburg and lobbying and educating and providing civic education to constituents and legislators alike. It was just a good decision, stepping out on faith to found an organization that's going to do something about who it is that's actually voting in Pennsylvania. So the New Pennsylvania Project, we're a voting rights organization, and on a year-round basis, not just around some campaign season, but on a year-round basis, we are doing voter registration, civic education, and mobilization. And we center historically disenfranchised communities, being Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color. We center the youth, which we consider under the age of 35, and we center immigrant communities. And we do this with intention, as these are the communities who have historically been disenfranchised, vote suppressed, and who are most impacted by decisions that our government is making. And we want to make sure everyone feels the necessity of voting in every single election. And in Pennsylvania, we vote twice a year, every year. So I also love to center any conversation that I'm having in our ancestors. I'm someone who honors our ancestors, and so it's so important to me to bring them to the forward. And I feel like in the year 2025, our ancestors are really talking to us in this year. And so I remind us of the late great Congressman John Lewis, who passed away just a little more than 5 years ago, who reminds us that the most powerful nonviolent change agent that we have in a democratic society is the vote. And that's how we bring about change. And that's how we've always brought about change in our community, is having our voices heard at the ballot box and coming out in record numbers. I also like to lift up John Lewis for another reason. This is a nice picture of him here. And he lived to be 80 years old. And that is an elder age for a civil rights icon. Because if you want to think about folks like Dr. King, assassinated at 39, Medgar Evers, assassinated at 37, Fannie Lou Hamer, whose heart went out at 59. Our civil rights icons don't live very long. And John Lewis lived to be 80 years old, and he's worth celebrating every day of the week. I'll say that in transparency, I worked on a campaign in 2016, and I got to meet the late, great Congressman John Lewis. He had a sweet tooth, and next to our campaign office was a candy shop. And I walked him over to the candy shop, and I ensured that I marched behind him to say that I marched with the great John Lewis. So, and respect for the ancestors. He has gone and joined the ancestors, John Lewis. All right. Well, this is a call for 1,000 women strong. And I would be remiss if I didn't lift up Black women in this moment who have been protecting, defending, deepening democracy in this country. And in this current moment where there is so much going on in our courtrooms across the country, especially in our United States courthouses, it is so important to lift up the Black women who have actually taken cases to the Supreme Court. And if you look at this visual, you see some from earliest days in the 50s into current day, including Janae Nelson, who is arguing the case in Louisiana in this moment before the Supreme Court, this case that is trying to suppress voting rights of folks from Louisiana. And what happens in Louisiana doesn't stay in Louisiana. This would absolutely gut the Voting Rights Act. And so it's so important that we lift up the women who are doing this work in this moment. Hashtag Trust Black Women, who are doing incredible work to ensure that our voting rights stay intact as they are severely under attack in this moment. I always love to also lift up Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. When you have a name like Kadida, you love to see a woman in power such as this with a name like Ketanji. And so I would argue that she is the most qualified jurist to ever be confirmed to the United States Supreme Court bench. And she shows that every day. And this is a copy from, a little more than a week ago, as this case is being heard in the United States Supreme Court regarding Louisiana and their redistricting gerrymandering case. And I pinpoint this post because it speaks to what is happening in the moment as it relates to our voting rights, as we have states looking to dilute voting power of voters, redistrict, draw lines, reapportion, redistrict, gerrymander. Justice Jackson has been someone protecting our voting rights from the bench. And this is just an excerpt. So the solicitor from Louisiana, their lawyer, says that plaintiff said, we want another majority Black district. And Justice Jackson said, no. They said, we aren't receiving equal electoral opportunity because our votes are being diluted. And the Louisiana solicitor said, same thing. And Jackson said, no, it's not. It is not that Black voters in Louisiana are asking for another majority Black district. It is that Black voters in Louisiana are asking to be equally heard at the ballot box. Okay, so I'm joined by folks hopefully from Pennsylvania today, and I want to share with you some alarming statistics about what is happening in this moment. As I said, I founded a voting rights organization that does lots of voter registration. We've assisted more than almost 60,000 Pennsylvanians in getting registered to vote in the Commonwealth in the last few years. And for us, the communities in which we center, it is very important that we highlight who it is that is not registered to vote in Pennsylvania in this moment. So eligible to vote, United States citizens, eligible to vote and unregistered. And that's 24% of all Black folks in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So almost 1 in 4 Black folks eligible to vote and not registered. And if we look at the Asian American Pacific Islander numbers, it is more than a third of that community eligible to vote and not registered, and almost 40% of Latinos eligible to vote and not registered. And know that Native Indigenous number is not a mistake. More than 90% of Native Americans, Indigenous people who live in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, are unregistered to vote. And so this is the largest voter gap that exists between ourselves, the people of color, and our white counterparts. Pennsylvania, the last census tells us that Pennsylvania is about 24% people of color, yet we make up 29% of those who are eligible to vote and not registered, compared to 11% of our white counterparts. And so the largest gap exists. And when I tell people that there are 1.5 million Pennsylvanians who are eligible to vote but not registered, minds are always blown. And this number jumps up to 2 million when you account for those who haven't voted in so long, they're about to be dropped off the voter rolls due to inactivity. And then to add more numbers to this, the number grows to 2.5 million Pennsylvanians who need to be contacted and registered to vote, because in November of next year, of 2026, we'll have lots of young people here in Pennsylvania turning of voting age to get them registered to vote as well. So there's a lot of work to do for organizations like ours that is engaging community on the ground, meeting them where they are, and trying to get them registered to vote and brought into the political process. And speaking of which, people talk about this all the time as we're on the ground doing voter registration and civic education. We'll have people say to us, I'm not interested in getting registered to vote. I'm not into politics. They'll say, I'm not into politics. And we'll say, well, politics are into you, and politics are everywhere. And so I know tonight's conversation is a nonpartisan conversation, meaning I'm not here tonight to tell you which way to vote. I'm here tonight to provide you with some factual information so you can make good decisions for yourself and your family, and you can vote your values. And that's all we can ask in this moment, that everybody comes out and votes. We vote twice a year, every year in Pennsylvania. And so I'm going to highlight your attention here to a couple of key issues in the Commonwealth. And the first and foremost is affordable housing. And we are in an affordable housing crisis in the Commonwealth. It is the number one issue across not only Pennsylvania, but across the country. And when you talk to someone and ask them the question, what's most important to you in this moment, they will tell you it's affordability. It's affording housing. It's affording food. It's affording clothing. It's affording utility bills. It's affordability. It's the number one issue. And I lift this up because not too many people, unfortunately, talk about it as much as they should. We'll have individuals, particularly candidates, who come to our churches on a Sunday and want to talk to us about the criminal justice system, or they want to talk to us about immigration and brown and Latino communities. But what they should be talking about is the affordable housing crisis, because it is the number one issue and it needs to be talked about more. The other issue I love to highlight, no particular reason besides this, and that is that marijuana legalization has happened in many states across the country. Pretty much every state surrounding Pennsylvania has either legalized marijuana or decriminalized it. And I lift it up because Pennsylvania is one of the most incarcerated states in the country, but we also have the dubious distinction of being one of the top 5 most incarcerated places on the planet Earth, not just the country. Top 5 most incarcerated places on the planet Earth. We have currently more than 66,000 Pennsylvanians locked up in our jails and prisons and ICE detention centers in this moment. And it's a huge number, and it makes Pennsylvania one of the most incarcerated places. And as a voting rights organization, we care about this for many reasons, but one of those being that when someone is incarcerated due to a felony conviction, and they're incarcerated due to that felony conviction, they are no longer with the franchise. They can no longer vote. They cannot vote. They cannot be registered to vote while I'm incarcerated with a felony conviction, and they cannot vote while incarcerated on a felony conviction. And a lot of times when they get out of incarceration and their feet are on the street, they've been lied to. Some may call it misinformation or disinformation, and I call it what I call it, which is a lie. And they're lied to sometimes, and they're told that they're not eligible to vote when they absolutely are. And we always say that if your feet are on the street, you are able to vote in the Commonwealth with very slight one-offs to that. But for the most part, the majority of those whose feet are on the street are eligible to vote in the Commonwealth. The other issues to lift up is education funding. It is school board elections. This is a local, municipal, and judicial election year. So in addition to the courts and the judges we're voting for this November 4th, we are also voting in our local and municipal elections. And school board make up some of those, that municipal election, your school boards. They're important elections and they're sleeping. They're overlooked in the same way the judicial elections are. People don't think that this is an election they need to come out for. And I'd argue that these local, municipal, and judicial elections are more important than a presidential election ever could be. And we need to vote in them more often and make sure that our voices are being heard there. Because those who start at the school board level later on run for state rep, later on run for Congress, and things even bigger than that. And so it's really important that we pay attention to those. And speaking of education in Pennsylvania, as I continue to alarm us about statistics here in Pennsylvania, we rank in the bottom percentile as it relates to school funding and how we fund our schools in the Commonwealth. How we do that is through property tax and through the happenstance of a child's birth, pretty much dictates what type of public education they're going to receive in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And for those of you who are watching today, and you're watching from the Philadelphia area, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that you can live on one side of City Avenue and go to Overbrook High, or you can live on the other side of City Avenue and go to Lower Merion, where Kobe Bryant went, and receive a totally different type of education. And not to say that young people can't succeed in both of those high school settings. And at the same time, we know in the same ways that separate is not equal, not equitably funding public education is also not equal and it's not fair. And so we have a ways to go for that as well. All right, I am a history buff. I hope others watching are history buffs as well. And not only do I like to center conversations in our ancestors, I also like to remind us of our history, because if we do not learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And so these billboards went up in the sky. And as you can see, these billboards were asking for the impeachment, the removal of Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Earl Warren. Well, why was the John Birch Society so upset with Chief Justice Earl Warren and his associate justices? Well, they were very upset at Chief Justice Earl Warren because, as this truck tells us, in the early 50s, it was his court that was overturning Jim Crow, right? De facto segregation, overturning Jim Crow with landmark cases such as Brown versus Board of Education that says that we should be able to go to the same schools, break bread together, enter the same entrances together, eat the same Woolworths lunch counters together. That was a decision under Chief Justice Earl Warren's court. Another one of those, Loving v. Virginia, the case in which said that anyone should be able to marry whoever it is they love, no matter their race. And these are just two decisions heard by this court that upset the John Birch Society so much that they wanted to have the justice impeached. And again, I show you this. As today, I'm talking about Pennsylvania courts. And so you may wonder, well, why am I talking about the United States courts when we're talking about Pennsylvania state courts today? And it is because if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And in 2025, I might say we might be doomed to remix that thing. And that's exactly what happened in Pennsylvania in the year 2018. And in the year 2018, we had legislators in Harrisburg upset about the decisions that our Pennsylvania Supreme Court was making, upset with them and wanting to impeach them, wanting to remove them from the bench over their decision to throw out a very gerrymandered congressional map. And so when we don't learn from history, we'll have others to try to remix that and repeat it. And this was the congressional map that had those folks upset that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court threw this out. This map, not to be confused by any mailers you may be getting in your mailbox, this map that you're seeing right here was created by legislators in Harrisburg. Legislators drew this map. They drew this 18 congressional district map, and this was the congressional district map we had for the 113th Congress. And as you can see, this map is kind of convoluted in looking at it. It was rated as one of the most gerrymandered congressional maps across the entire country. Anyone joining from North Carolina today, we can go back and forth and argue about who had the worst gerrymandered maps. But this map here was absolutely disgraceful as it relates to gerrymandering and diluting voting power. I like to draw your attention to southeastern Pennsylvania, right above Philadelphia. And I would love for you to see the city of Reading, which is the 5th largest city in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. City of Reading is home to a lot of Black and brown folks. A lot of Black and brown folks live in the city of Reading. And as you can see, the city of Reading is currently a little pink purple dot there surrounded by a green area, Congressional District 6, the rest of Berks County. And what happened with this map is that legislators who drew this map, they took just the city of Reading and they picked it up and they dropped it off into Lancaster County, Congressional District 16. Why would you pick up all the Black and brown folks who live in the city of Reading and drop them off into Lancaster County? Anyone who knows anything about Pennsylvania knows who lives in Lancaster County and who doesn't. And so what you do when you do this is you dilute the voting power of all those Black and brown folks by sticking them into a very homogeneous Lancaster County and robbing them of the opportunity to actually choose an elected official of their choosing. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court said this is a much more fair map, and this is the map through the help of a map master was created with 18 congressional districts, just like the last. I'll go back again. We went from that to this. And as you can see in Berks County, the city of Reading is there in Berks County. It has not been picked up and moved into Lancaster County Congressional District 11 in this map. And so that is the power of the courts. This is why courts matter. They make decisions, interpret the Pennsylvania Constitution based on the fact that our Pennsylvania Constitution guarantees us free and fair elections. And according to our Pennsylvania Constitution, that was not happening with that gerrymandered map. And our Pennsylvania Supreme Court interpreted our Constitution in a way that said that we must redo these congressional maps to make them more fair. Now, when the folks in the legislators in Harrisburg couldn't impeach those Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices, they went for the next tactic, which was to change the way we, as very powerful Pennsylvania voters, actually put them on the bench. Pennsylvania voters are very powerful. We're one of only 7 states in the entire country that we get to elect all of our judges and justices in partisan elections. We are only joined by Ohio, Illinois, North Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, in those 7 states that I mentioned that all vote for judges and justices in the same way. And so that makes us very powerful in Pennsylvania. And so we're so powerful that legislators wanted to change the way that we actually elect our judges and justices in Pennsylvania so that we could no longer vote for them, all 31 appellate and intermediate appellate court statewide judges. We'd only be able to vote for 3 of them because legislators in Harrisburg were going to draw a judicial map to determine what districts we live in, to determine what type of judge we were able to elect to the bench. And so that was going to be House Bill 38. House Bill 38 moved through the halls of Harrisburg. It was going to change the Pennsylvania Constitution, change the way that we elect judges and justices. And as the organization that I was leading at the time, Why Courts Matter Pennsylvania, we formed a group with Common Cause of Pennsylvania and Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts. We gathered more than 150 other grassroots organizations, and we threw down together to stop House Bill 38 that was going to gerrymander our judiciary. So we threw down together. We did such a great job with that eclectic group that we had that we made the front page of the New York Times when we defeated the attempt to gerrymander our judiciary. And so this is the power of our own advocacy and knowing that after we vote, that's great. And then we need to hold elected officials accountable and pay attention to what's happening in our halls of government. So I've been walking you through the various attacks on judicial fairness. First, they tried to impeach those Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices. When that didn't work, they tried to gerrymander the judiciary and change the way we as powerful voters actually put them on the bench. That took more than 2 years to defeat. And then an anti-retention campaign was launched on New Year's Eve of last year at a farmer's market in Manheim Township, Lancaster County, an anti-retention campaign that had signs up on a table that said, vote no on the 3 Supreme Court justices' retention elections. And so again, in Pennsylvania, we actually vote for all of our judges and we determine whether or not they should be retained for another term. And so an anti-retention campaign was launched. And was historical. This is historical. There has never been millions of dollars spent by folks to try to disrupt the independent judiciary and remove justices from the bench. This is a historic campaign involving millions of dollars. Now, this is our Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now, unlike the United States Supreme Court that has 9 justices, our Pennsylvania Supreme Court has 7. Our United States Supreme Court justices are appointed and confirmed to the bench for a lifetime. And here in Pennsylvania, we elect our judges and justices, and we elect them the first time in a partisan election, meaning we'll see the D or R or any other party after their name when we initially elect them, and then we won't see it again after that. And so in Pennsylvania, we're an old state. We have the oldest courthouses in the country. And as you can see, these 7 justices here, there's not that much diversity in terms of race, never has been in Pennsylvania in terms of race on our Supreme Court. But you can see that Pennsylvania does elect women in a statewide way on our courts. And it took us 300 years to have our first woman Chief Justice there in the center, Chief Justice Deborah Todd. It only took 300 years to put a woman there on the bench in that position. The makeup of these justices as elected originally, 5 of them ran as Democrats and 2 of them ran as Republicans. And again, they will serve a 10-year term. And then after their 10-year term is up, they stand for retention and they ask you to let them stay on for another 10 years. And that is what we have this year. We have retention elections happening this year, and Pennsylvanians get to determine whether to vote yes to keep them on the bench for another 10 years or vote no and remove them from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and likely from all courts across the Pennsylvania when that happens. Okay, so who are the 3 justices that are standing for retention this year? So they're marked with the red asterisks here. That's Christine Donahue, Kevin Doherty, and David Wecht. All 3 of them were initially elected as Democrats. But as I said, they are standing for retention this year because they were elected 10 years ago and they've been on the bench for 10 years. And now they're standing for a nonpartisan retention election. You will not see the D after their name on your ballot. You will only see their name and a yes or no circle to fill in, and that is it. And Pennsylvanians will decide to circle yes to keep them or circle no to remove them from the bench. And I say remove them from the bench to not be replaced, because in Pennsylvania, the only way to replace justices that have been removed from the bench is for our governor, Josh Shapiro, and 2/3 of our Pennsylvania Senate to agree on someone to sit in that vacancy at an interim time period. And I joke that we all probably have a better shot at winning the Powerball than we do at having the governor and the Senate agree. The only other alternative would be the 2027 judicial election. We have every odd year as a judicial election. And so we would see vacancies. If all 3 are not retained, we would see vacancies on our Supreme Court for more than 2 years, which would leave us with 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the Supreme Court bench, and them also unlikely to agree or be able to come to some consensus with that even number. All right, so there's levels to our courts, and there's more than just retention elections for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. There's also a retention election for the Superior Court. And on the bottom left there is Alice Beck DeBow. She has been on this bench for 10 years, and so she is standing for retention, asking for another 10-year term. There's also a vacancy on our Superior Court. There's a vacancy because someone on this court was elevated to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And so there's a vacancy here, and it is asking for you to actually choose between 2 candidates. Actually, the Superior Court is choosing between 3 candidates on your ballot this November 4th or before if you're voting by mail. And as I mentioned in the last picture there with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, you can see that Pennsylvania does a great job of electing women to this statewide court as well. Not so much people of color. As you can see the visual here, there's actually 2 Black women on the Superior Court, Judge Carolyn Nichols and Judge Tamika Lane. But prior to that, this court really lacked some diversity here. There are 31 intermediate and Supreme Court judges and justices, and of the 31, only 3 of them are people of color. They all happen to be all Black women. That tells us that 10% of our highest courts have a person of color sitting on that bench. And as Pennsylvania is more than 24% folks of color, there's an opportunity there to ensure we have better diversity on our bench. The other intermediate appellate court in Pennsylvania that also has a retention election is the Commonwealth Court. And the bottom left-hand corner is Judge Michael Wojcik. He has been on this bench for 10 years, and so now he's asking for another 10-year term. There's also 1 vacancy on this court as we had a judge retire. And so because there is a vacancy, there will be an election to fill the vacancy, and you will see a challenge. You will see 2 folks going up against each other, challenging each other for the vacant seat. So in addition to retention elections, we also have judicial elections where we have some folks that are going to run against each other for vacancies. All right. And I'll say this again. So both of these courts have 10-year terms. And then after that, they stand for retention, and you decide whether or not to retain them or not. All right, there's levels to our courts, from the minor courts to our Court of Common Pleas to our intermediate appellate courts, being the Superior Court and the Commonwealth Court, and then our Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And so if you take a look here about what these courts are about, the types of cases that they hear, how many judges sit there, it's important that we know this. There are so many people, unfortunately, who do not vote in our judicial elections. It's because they don't know what these judges do. Maybe they've never met one. Maybe they're kind of happy about that or not, but they've never met one. They don't know the types of cases they hear, and they probably don't even know that we have the power to vote for them all. So in minor courts here in Pennsylvania, magisterial courts, municipal courts, in Pennsylvania, magisterial courts are very important. They're going to hear the majority of cases, small claims, evictions, traffic, speeding tickets, parking tickets. That's the minor courts. Court of Common Pleas will hear cases that can't be heard at the minor court level. They're going to hear your trial court cases. So if you ever got called for jury duty, you were probably at the Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania. And then above the Court of Common Pleas is your Superior Court. And that is where folks will go if they have an appeal to their case at a lower court, appeal there at the Superior Court. And then the Commonwealth Court, uniquely a Pennsylvania court, hears cases involving agency, such as cases involving clean air and water. They heard a very important case around the way in which we fund public education in Pennsylvania. It was William Penn High versus the Commonwealth that argued that the way Pennsylvania funds public education was unconstitutional, because our Pennsylvania Constitution guarantees young people in the Commonwealth an efficient and thorough public education. And the Commonwealth Court, at the insistence there of the Supreme Court, said that the way we fund is unconstitutional, and now they've thrown it to the legislators in Harrisburg to figure out how to fund it appropriately. And then the final level, which we've been talking about, which is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. All right, I'm about to close out here. I'm going to share some pictures of some of my favorite Pennsylvanians. This is Miss Viviette Applewhite out of Philadelphia, who in her 90s was the lead litigant in a voting rights case because a more restrictive voter ID bill was moving through the halls of Harrisburg, which was going to disrupt her perfect record, voting for every single president since FDR. It was going to ask or demand of Miss Viviette Applewhite to be able to show an ID she was not going to be able to provide. There's other laws going through the halls of various legislative bodies right now, including the SAVE Act, one of those in DC, that will require people to show a birth certificate or a passport in order to get registered to vote and vote. And so many people do not have access to those things. Passports are not cheap. And so it was this bill moving through the halls of Harrisburg that was going to restrict her ability to vote. And as the lead litigant, she argued before the Commonwealth Court in Pennsylvania that a more restrictive voter ID was going to stop her vote. Well, she was successful. The Commonwealth Court ruled in her favor and said that Pennsylvania already has voter ID laws on the books, that we should just honor those, which we are in the Commonwealth. Only citizens are getting registered. Only citizens are voting. And that's a picture of Miss Viviette Applewhite on her 100th birthday, who lived a long, beautiful life. And she has since gone on to be with the ancestors. Well, she reminds us how important it is to know that individuals, these are real individuals, real cases, real people's lives impacted. Some may argue, oh, what's the big deal? This is one woman. Why? What's the big deal? Well, we say that one person disenfranchised is one person too many. Kara out of Delaware County. Kara did what we're supposed to do. When you request a vote by mail ballot and it doesn't arrive in time, you go to your polling location and you vote a provisional ballot. And that's exactly what she did. She voted that in 2020. And after she voted her ballot successfully, she was notified that someone was challenging her provisional ballot. Well, it was the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and those justices that I mentioned before who said, we are going to count Kiera's ballot. We are going to strike down any attempts to throw out valid provisional ballots, and we're going to make sure people's voices are heard and their votes count. And this is the power of our courts. And I say this, and I show you the real human beings, because so often our communities have a very negative connotation of courts, and they're associated with the criminal court system, criminal justice court system, and not so much the courts that actually provide rights and freedoms and grant rights and freedoms for our folks. Or we have those who maybe not understanding the difference between federal courts and state courts. And so we need to make sure they're hearing this today as well, that if you're not happy with the United States Supreme Court, you shouldn't take your anger out on one court versus the other. They are completely different bodies. We all learned about federalism maybe in the 10th grade, which gives us federal courts and it gives us state courts. I'm someone who believes in facts. These are great places to go if you need some resources where I get a lot of my information. I love the organization Alliance for Justice, afj.org. They do incredible work. They've informed my work for the last 8 years in Pennsylvania as it relates to federal courts and state courts. I also like to go to the uscourts.gov, or you can go to pacourts.us and read up on how these judges and justices have ruled on cases. Have they determined cases correctly and according to the Pennsylvania State Constitution? I always say that our judges and justices don't wear red robes. They don't wear blue robes. Our judges and justices wear black robes. They wear black robes for the people and for the words in the Constitution. And so when we have retention elections like we do this year, perhaps it shouldn't matter what political party they used to belong to or belong to when they were elected. It should only matter what they've been doing for the last 10 years. And you can find out how they've ruled on cases at these places. And with that, here I stand in Chester County today. I say, go birds, go vote, go birds, go vote. And when I'm in Steeler country, I'm going to shout them out too. And so I'm very open here for any questions and comments anyone in the chat may have today.
I first want to thank you so much. This was a wealth of information that voters can use going into this election here. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. Take these off. This is a wealth of information that voters can use going into this election. What is being, I guess, done on the ground from your vantage point to turn out those voters who like they kind of lean toward those national elections that are, the ones that get the most attention, and they may not be I guess as apt to turn out in a judge's race, because that's not considered like a sexy type of race, but these races impact our everyday life. So from your vantage point, what are we doing to turn out those voters within the next 8 days or so?
Yeah. So great question. Yes. In Pennsylvania, presidential election year, 77% turnout. This year, judicial election turnout hovers somewhere between 17% and up to 30% in various counties across the Commonwealth. People don't come out for these elections. They consider these elections low turnout due to low information voters.
Yeah.
That folks that do not have the information about the courts just don't come out to vote in them because they don't know who they are, what they do, and they just don't come out. Or they don't recognize how important they are to our daily lives. And I'd always argue that these elections are more important than our presidential. They impact our daily lives first and foremost and quicker than anything that can happen in the federal government. So for organizations like ours, grassroots organizations, we've been on the ground all year. This didn't just start for us ahead of this election. We've been on the ground this year, last year. We've been talking about the courts for quite some time. That's important because we must earn the trust of the communities in which we're engaging. We must be the trusted messenger to give them the information they need to feel good about actually going to the polls and voting when they don't know exactly sometimes what it is they're doing in there. So it is grassroots efforts to knock on doors, and this could be done in a partisan or nonpartisan way. There are lots of organizations that are running independent expenditure campaigns, like the New Pennsylvania Project is in this moment. There are C3 nonpartisan organizations like the New PA Project Education Fund, our other organization, the other affiliated organization, who has led efforts around providing civic education in a nonpartisan way, such as handing out these nonpartisan voter guides to educate people about who these justices are, cases they've heard, so they can make determinations about whether or not they want to put them on the bench for another 10 years or not. There have folks that are making phone calls, text messages, postcards. There's so much being done right now because there's been so much attention given to this race because there was an anti-retention campaign launched, like, again, as I said, historical. Therefore, it's I guess the blessing in this is that now we have to engage people in a more meaningful way to give them the civic education they need to be informed and feel good about making their votes on November 4th or before. So yeah, there's engagement happening on the ground like never before for a judicial election because there needs to be that in this moment.
And I know that different courts in different states do different things. And as I was listening to you, there were a lot of parallels to what's happening in Pennsylvania, things that are happening in Alabama, like with a high incarceration rate and the different attacks on reproductive freedoms and so forth and so on. Are there any I guess like upcoming fights that the Pennsylvania courts are going to be deciding soon, that we need to be on the lookout for
Yeah.
to educate people on or advocate for?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the courts in the last 10 years, as I mentioned, a few of them have heard cases around provisional ballots, making sure our voting
Mhm.
rights count. They've heard cases around reproductive justice and access to abortion. There'll probably be more of those in the coming years. They'll absolutely be hearing cases in the coming years, particularly as we have a federal election next year, about
Mhm.
whether or not ballots should count. That'll be
Mhm.
another case that comes before them. Clean air and water cases, absolutely coming. Environmental justice cases coming before the courts. Pennsylvania's constitution guarantees us, according to the Pennsylvania Constitution, we are guaranteed clean air, pure water, and a scenic environment. It's guaranteed in our Pennsylvania Constitution. And if you're not getting it, you should sue somebody. And so I'm sure there'll be some folks suing somebody in these courts over that in the coming years. So these are just some of the cases between the education funding for our schools. Various things can be heard by our courts, and they matter. And unfortunately, as you said, they're not the sexiest of the branches of government. You know, people give all their attention to the executive branch or the legislative branch, and these judicial elections are sleepy, and they're important. And as someone who does a lot of work around the courts, I argue probably the most important branch of all three of our governments, although they're co-equal.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we kind of we miss the mark where that's concerned. I think that we realize that something is important after the election and kind of after we're stuck with certain policies for X number of years. And like these courts, like the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court of Alabama, the Supreme Court of the United States, these are generational types of changes that are done, and they are hard to be unworked and reworked where that's concerned. It's just it's kind of like I said, it's unfortunate that we sometimes realize that after the fact. And I know that judges they cannot campaign in a
Right,
way that a senator can
right.
to so they can't do these town halls and all these types of things because they're supposed to be nonpartisan. They're judges, they can't even ask for money.
Mhm.
And so it's just it's an interesting predicament that we sometimes find ourselves in races like this.
Yeah. I don't know about Alabama's court, although, Alabama's one of these seven states that I had mentioned.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure how you all are handling any integrity issues in your court, if you find any issues related to that. But in Pennsylvania state courts, there's a code of conduct, and you mentioned some of that, right? They can't campaign, they can't raise money. But you think about the United States Supreme Court, and there are no rules or regulations for them. They can just do whatever the heck they want to do,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
we're living through that in this moment.
Right.
So that's why I can always and well multiple times lift up that our state courts are very different in many aspects to our federal courts. In Alabama, I'm sure what you all have going on in your courts might be very different than what we have going on in our state courts right now. But I know
Mhm.
that we are electing them the same way, and it makes us powerful. And I wish more of our folks came out and voted in them.
Absolutely. We have still have work to do,
Yeah.
but there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Hmm.
I think Joy has some questions.
Yes, I'm finally back home. I was picking up my kid when we first initially started. So being here in Virginia and having touched courts in different capacities throughout my life here and as well as just being a Black person out living in the world. And because overall there's so much despondency, there's so much, I don't want to have to be bothered with this. I don't want to think about this. And I've been burned by this institution, by the court system so many times. How do we honor and acknowledge that anger while also pushing that we have to move forward and change some things.
Yeah.
I think that kind of also falls into voting as well, because that's something that we talk about with the
Mhm.
org. But I would love to hear your thoughts specifically with court.
Yeah, it's I always quote Beyonce's song Love on Top, and it's put the courts on top. You know, it's whatever issues you care about, you got to put the courts on top because they're eventually going to arbitrate all the things you care about. You care about immigrants' rights, it's going to be heard in the courtroom. You care about LGBTQ issues, it's going to be heard in the courtroom. You care whatever you care about is going to be heard in the courtroom. And so it's connecting that dot, that all the issues, all the politics that surround our lives are heard in courtrooms. And so for us as an organization, just last week, I was in two high schools. I was in Overbrook High School, one of the ones that I mentioned that is not equity funded. I was in Overbrook High School and I was in Bartram High School in Philadelphia. And both of those high schools are underfunded. And both of those high schools, I addressed 16, 17, 18-year-olds who were enthralled by this conversation for a full hour and gave us their undivided attention. 16, 17, 18-year-olds gave us their full undivided attention for an hour talking about this because we had to make it real for them. They understand cases like when Meek Mill went before a
Right.
judge in
Yeah.
Philadelphia, right?
Yep.
So they
Yep.
understand that. So we have to make it real for them so they can connect the dots. But then when you talk about honor the issues people have with courts, yeah, it's a yes and. Yeah, I understand the criminal justice system has locked up your family and incarcerated them at disproportionate rates. And then also there are courts that granted adoption or made sure you went to go live with a family member you wanted to go live with. And so we have to lift up the positive things that are happening in the courts as well, because as I mentioned, as a community, we tend to have a negative connotation of courts based upon criminal justice.
Yep.
And we don't think about some of the times in which our rights and freedoms are actually granted by the courts. We know Black women, at one point in history, we were 3/5 of a person, and then the court said, no, you're a whole person,
Yep.
right? So you have to honor the things that people say, and that's just part of active listening. And that's how we're getting young people registered to vote who are like, nah, I'm good. We're like, all right, well, let me listen to you. What's your issue? Let's talk about it. And hopefully I can change your mind. And maybe you do want to join this electorate and get to voting. So it is listening, it's the active listening, finding out what the issues that they have. Why do people hate the courts? Why is there a negative connotation? And then honoring that, and then also talking about the favorable things that can be done in the courtroom as well, so that we can draw people out to vote. I mean, if you hate a system, why would you want to be involved in voting in it? And I'd say if
Yeah.
you hate a system, then you want to be involved in voting for it and in it because you want to change it.
Mm. So that's really interesting because that flip of the conversation isn't often pushed. It's more, it's usually, we hate this thing, so we're going to avoid it. Or we hate
Yep.
this thing and we're going to just be angry towards it and
Mm-hmm.
avoid and do everything that we can to not touch it as much as possible.
Yeah.
And we don't often think, and I think that's due to overwhelm on both sides. Overwhelm with the anger and the frustration with the system that has been intentionally used against you, while also the overwhelm of, we want this to be complicated.
Mhm.
We want you to struggle with this.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's too often that people allow the room to say, yeah, you hate this thing? Cool, let's
Yeah.
change it. Like, I don't,
Yeah.
that isn't often pointed out. It's more so just, okay, well, you hate this thing, we're just gonna move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's cases to cite, in Philadelphia in particular, there was a judge, the judge that I mentioned that worked on Meek Mill's case, who made it so that he couldn't travel and do his work.
Yep.
And Philadelphians came together and said, well, this judge shouldn't be on the bench anymore. And
Hmm.
they launched an anti-retention campaign against her before she even announced whether or not she was going to stand for retention. And to the point where she just decided before that even happened, she just resigned herself from the bench. So
Hmm.
you can absolutely, the power of the people is still a thing, and you can still overcome, and there's still power in our voices and our collective when we come together. And so change can happen, but we have to be involved in the process. And we throw our hands up and say, I don't like it. I'm just not going to do anything about it. I'm going to hope and pray it goes away. That's not going to
Yeah,
do it because those who are voting are having their voices heard. They're getting their needs met. And when you don't vote, you are voting. You're saying, I'm going to let somebody else make a decision for me.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
I know we're getting close to time. So I have one more question, then I'm going to throw it back to Tania. Um, we are 8 days away. We're 8 and a wake up, I think. away from general elections throughout the country, with everything that's happening in the country right now, with Black women specifically resting, resisting, working differently to make sure that our voices are heard versus being out in the street doing things that were expected of us, or we kind of laid the charges on 5 years ago, 3 years ago, whichever. Now we're kind of going, oh no, y'all got it. As we're
Yeah.
heading into the election day of a really long year, what encouragement, what parting words would you potentially have, not only for Pennsylvania, but for a nation?
Yeah. As long as we have the vote, we have hope, right? So as long as we have the ability to vote, we have hope. And I guess my parting conversation tonight is we must vote in this year's judicial election to ensure we have an election next year, to ensure our votes are counting in the 2026 election. This year will set up how free and fair our elections are in 2026, and hopefully avoid the shenanigans that could potentially happen. And we come from people who have always had to make our voices heard. And when we have not been given the opportunity, we make ourselves an opportunity. I hear, some say I'm sitting this one out a little bit. I'm going to hydrate. I'm going to learn some line dances, and I'm going to sit this out. And some are doing that and some are not. I'm someone who, this is my job. So I can't sit this out. I also want my voice to be heard because I think I have a narrative and I have a story to tell that others can't in this moment and others need to hear. So not shading or shaming anybody for the decisions they decide to make and how they and decide to advocate for themselves and self-agency in this moment, because we all have to do different things to protect our mental peace at this time. And I'll say that, for me, I'm protecting my mental peace by knowing that I'm leaving it all out on the field. Everything's going to be a football reference for me. I'm leaving it all out on the field. And that I know that when I wake up on November 5th, no matter what happens, I did everything I possibly could to deepen this democracy. And I say deepen, I don't say defend. I say to deepen democracy because we know democracy hasn't always worked for us, wasn't intended to always work for us. So what can we do to make this better? And Black women have always been at the forefront of this. So I'm going to be out there. I was at the No Kings rally. I was one of the speakers at the No Kings rally in Philadelphia. It was 200,000 people out there. That's probably the largest crowd I've ever spoken in front of. But I wanted to be there, and I wanted to give the message that we need to come out and we need to vote, and we need to make our voices heard, and then we need to hold elected officials accountable after we vote.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my parting conversation here for tonight, is that change has come about in our communities by voting. We voted in mass numbers, souls to the polls, block voting, 50s and 60s when we were allowed in the 50s, 60s and 70s. We were voting in record numbers. Today, we're not voting, and elected officials don't need to listen to us. They don't care to listen to us because we're not putting them in office or taking them out of office. And so that's my parting comment. This is how we bring about change. John Lewis behind me again. This is how we bring about change. We must vote, and we cannot relinquish the power that we have. And if it didn't matter so much, so many wouldn't try to stop us from doing it.